Hi everyone, this video will walk you through briefly a behaviorist approach to lesson planning. Notice that I am going to be focusing on lesson planning here, not classroom management, because behaviorism is very strongly influential in the field of classroom management as well. And I'm going to close with a little bit of an overview briefly on behavioristic approaches to reading instruction as well, as it can affect your lesson planning. Now, I try to highlight for you certain videos that give you an overview of the field, certain videos that give you an overview of debates, and certain videos that I make that would be good for you to very strategically save and rewatch before you do job interviews and utilize in your careers. And this is one of them that would be very important for you to rewatch before you do a job interview. Tie this in with a separate video that I'm going to be making on how do you do instructional objectives, how do you do your lesson planning, and that in that regard tied in with Bloom's taxonomy. I'm making a separate video on that because this video would become overly long if I try to do that all in this one video. This is more of a broad overview. But what I'm telling you here is that even though you're studying different approaches to lesson planning, socio-emotional, constructivist, approaches to lesson planning as they're impacted in district policies at the state level is a quilt weaving approach in that all of these learning theories that you're going to be studying have an influence on what's being recommended at the district and state level. Certainly socio-emotional learning is very strongly emphasized too. So I'm not saying that's not being emphasized, but behaviorism is very strongly tied into how the district wants your lesson plans to be written, and it's very strongly tied into how the state and district wants you to think about the teaching of objectives and skills, be it reading skills, math skills, etc. And so it's really important to have a good, clear understanding of what we're talking about here when it comes to your job interviews and so forth. So first of all, think about how are you going to give positive and negative reinforcement to behaviors, not just classroom management behaviors, but writing behaviors, reading behaviors, mathematical behaviors, right? And so we need to look into some of the implications for your lesson planning. And the book does a good job of that. So when writing your instructional objectives, make sure that they are clearly understood by the students and that you write them in a very clear manner. Explain the relevance between the objective and the material that the students are going to learn. Help students see the benefits of the learning, oftentimes in an anticipatory set that ties what you're going to be doing today with what they learned the previous day and sparks their curiosity for more learning. And make sure that students understand what are the desired outcomes and how will the students demonstrate these outcomes. When you write your rationale on your lesson plan or your curriculum design, think about what activities will the students perform in order to meet the objectives. These are very specific activities. And how will you assess progress on these activities? Remember, in a behavioristic sense, it's not just enough to say that students are learning. You have to be able to demonstrate certain behaviors that shows learning progress. So with your rationale is basically a justification for the instructional choices you're making. And remember, if you choose to emphasize one thing, that means that you're not emphasizing another thing. If students are doing one thing, that means there's no time in the classroom for certain cuts that have to be made. So why are you making these decisions? When you talk about your instructional goals, goals are statements about what is to be learned in this classroom. Think of them as basically a target that you're trying to hit. When you write your instructional objectives, your objectives are basically the foundation upon which you build your lessons, and your assessments are tied to how will the students demonstrate certain learning goals. Each objective should be linked to at least one state standard. Think of objectives as basically the tools that you use to make sure the students are meeting the learning goals, kind of like arrows that you shoot to meet your target. You want to use Bloom's taxonomy. Now, interestingly enough, as you might remember in a previous discussion, Bloom was more of a cognitivist than a behaviorist, but the states across the nation have really, when they look for how your lesson plans are to be written, they've created what we often call Bloom's action verbs. That demonstrate how students are demonstrating these cognitive and affective domains, and so, or psychomotor domains. Remember, there's three domains: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor when we talk about Bloom's taxonomy. And so Bloom's action verbs turn these domains into demonstrated behavioral objectives. And the objectives are tied to state standards. We'll talk more about Bloom's taxonomy and a writing of lesson plan objectives in a separate video. Your activities and assessments and grading should all be based upon specific objectives. As you develop your learning objective, be sure to determine what you want your students to learn and how they will demonstrate this learning. And that's key to what the state would consider high quality instruction. Objectives help you identify the difference between what you consider critical and what you consider non-critical in your instruction. And objectives guide this design of a series of linear, interrelated instructional activities and topics that you do in your lesson. A key question that you can ask as you write your instructional objectives: what knowledge do you expect the students to be able to demonstrate? Or what skill do you expect the students to be able to demonstrate? When you design an anticipatory set, focus the learner's attention on the lesson for the day. Tie this lesson in with previous learning and state this very specific objective for that activity. Ideally, in an anticipatory set, you're also building anticipation, building curiosity. Your objectives need to be very clearly stated. Students need to understand the expectations. Oftentimes, it's good to use graphics, visuals, auditory aids to explain the material. And you want to guide students through the positive reinforcement of repetition and practice. And remember, this is supposed to be very direct instruction, explicit instruction. For the most part. Make sure the directions and expectations are very clear. How will the students tell the difference between work that is quality or not? Have students paraphrase directions oftentimes. Minimize distractions. Describe the very specific expectations, the activities, and the evaluation procedures. Start with an anticipatory set that's motivational and build lesson upon prior student knowledge. Develop very specific behavioral objectives in your classroom and move around and monitor student work. Vary the methods in which students will practice the development of these skills so that students don't become bored. And ongoing assessment is very much key here. Remember, you have to have evidence for the learning. Don't just tell your principal that learning is going to take place. And this is very much information-based instruction, data-based instruction. So your evidence guides your next approaches. It guides whether you need to review the material further or not. Generally speaking, you move forward when the majority of students in your class are demonstrating mastery of the knowledge or the skill. And for those students who are not, then you go toward Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions in a response to intervention model. We'll cover that in a different video that I'll make. Your feedback should be very specific to the students. So saying good job, okay, fine, but what does good job actually mean? Tie it to specifically how the students met learning objectives and what they specifically did. Now, behaviorism is very influential in the reading field. It's not the only learning theory, and in fact, when you read about some of these debates that are taking place in the reading field, what are sometimes problematically called reading wars, in many ways, this is a debate between how learning theory can be applied in the reading field. It's, for instance, a debate between learning theory in the reading process as applied through constructivism versus learning theory as applied to behaviorism. Advocates of behavioristic approaches to reading instruction view reading as a linear process of skill development and skill behaviors involving very discrete parts. The recognition and demonstrating of recognition of sound parts, phonemic awareness, the parts of words and constituent parts of words, decoding of words, and applying this decoding in very specific steps using phonics rules, for instance, or fluency. This builds sequentially toward fluency. Fluency being, of course, reading with appropriate pace, appropriate tone, and of course you need to have vocabulary, the recognition of vocabulary and making sense of vocabulary, building toward comprehension. This is seen as very discrete, linear process in a behavioristic sense as applied to instruction. So students engage in practice and reinforcement in a very systemic way in your classroom, in a behavioristic sense. And clue in on here, make no mistake, this approach to reading instruction that I'm talking about here in the tail end of this video, this is the approach to reading instruction that the state wants. Make no mistake, when you look at the RISE trainings, the RISE professional development trainings that the state wants you to do, or when you look at the state's approach to reading instruction that they want you to do, and when you look at the language of what's called the science of reading, that's a long topic, but when you look at that, you should be able to see after you finish this course and look at the comparison of these different learning theories, you should be able to see strong influence of behaviorism in here. So if you want to get a job and you want to interview for this job, understanding behaviorism as it applies to classroom instruction will help you sound good in that job interview. Reading is conceptualized as a conditioned behavior. For instance, you want to diagnose what's happening in the reading process, diagnose possible problems, prescribe what we can do about it, and remediate when there are possible problems. So the act of reading is viewed as competent through properly sequenced and performing of discrete skills in phonics, discrete skills in fluency, etc. And oftentimes there are repetition and practice of reading behaviors through stimulus and response in your classroom. You want to link this with carefully chosen rewards and punishments, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement as well. Reading is viewed as habituated, as built through repetition and practice and guided feedback. For instance, a child might be presented with simple CAT and immediately produce the desired word cat, for one example. So you want to think about structuring and control of materials very carefully in your classroom. You want to think about how will you identify possible problems and remediate possible problems. That's where response to intervention techniques come in. You want to analyze what appropriate behaviors look like as students demonstrate and practice certain skills, and how you can practice them, and how you can give stimuli to students that will promote certain skill development. You want to study the component parts of the reading processes and help students understand these component parts of the reading process. Now, this is not all of you who see this video are in one of my reading courses, but Scarborough's reading rope is being very strongly emphasized that you want students to understand Scarborough's reading rope. Many teachers are literally putting Scarborough's reading rope up on the wall and having students study the reading processes that are described in Scarborough's reading rope. It wouldn't be a bad idea in your instruction, actually. I guarantee your principal would like it. So reading is seen as a perceptual activity. Phonics instruction is seen as a key part of the groundwork for beginning reading instruction. And finally, you want to think about how are students processing these visual signals, how are they translating these signals, and in a very linear process, you build from bottom up, from decoding on up toward eventual words, phrases, and sentences. So hopefully this helped you as you think about behaviorism in the classroom. Take care of yourselves.